Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline from the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today we got a treat presentation on the topic of executing strategy with Ajay Raikar, a friend of mine. And today I'm working with a little bit of a challenge. I'm in the airport. You may hear some background noise. Shortly I'm going to mute myself, and after I make some introductory comments, we'll be turning it over to Ajay. And just some housekeeping items here. I've tried to mute everyone on the phone. If you do find yourself with some background noise, if you could mute your phone, that would be great. This webinar is being recorded for your access to information later, as well as forwarding it to others. And so I'll be sending along that link a little later today, so you'll have access to that. A little background context. This is the model that we currently advise about, a model for sustainability. And Ajay may be speaking to some of the topics here, probably primarily around systems. And I know that when I think about systems and the advice we're giving to people these days, we talk about how every system connects to the purpose of an organization, what we call true north. And many times organizations start their work with a daily management system, primarily focusing on helping the front line, primarily focusing on the problems of the day, including activities such as communication, problem solving. Managers in an ideal world would spend about 50% of their time working in that system. And leaders have some role in that system, but their primary work is around thinking about the problems of the future. And that's where a lot of the work around strategy deployment comes in. And so this is one way to think about that. Some of the other things we've been talking about is the role of standard work, specifically leader standard work, as a way to connect the daily management system to the strategy deployment system. And so with the materials that Ajay has put together today, probably primarily talking about strategy deployment, but also connecting to some of the other work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ajay, and he'll go through the materials that he's presented for us today. Take it away, Ajay.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate this opportunity to share with you and the rest of the audience some of the learnings that we've had in doing a little bit of the lean stuff across the country and around the world. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about us. We've been around for 15 years. We've been implementing, helping organizations to define and achieve their long-term objectives, both in North America as well as around the world. Really, we do multiple things. We help clients with business analytics. We implement operational performance challenge improvements. But more importantly, more and more, we're also helping our clients develop their long-term strategy as well as execute their long-term strategy. And then, most importantly, we also help build the organizational capability so they can sustain these improvements on their own. We operate in multiple industries, from aerospace and automotive, and recently healthcare and process industries. And from each of these industries, the specifics are different. So our model, we don't have a uniform model. It's tailored to the specific of the client as well as the industry they operate in. So I'm going to share with you some of our key learnings from deploying operational and business excellence programs across diverse industries. We're not going to be tool focused. It's going to be more about what we have learned that either impedes or enables sustainable improvement. And I would welcome to hear about your experiences. Perhaps they are similar or perhaps they are not, but would love to hear that at the end of this presentation. Mike, could you go to the next slide, please, Mike? Okay. So fundamentally, to be successful, policy deployment needs to occur at every level. And I guess most of you know that. But it also needs to happen, and it's very important to understand that every level of the organization fully understands believes in and supports the new policy. And oftentimes when I'm with clients, I use this example of a solid block of steel to explain why this needs to happen at every level. So consider that triangle to be a big block of steel, really cold. And, we have a CEO at the top level who wants to drive this change to this new strategic direction. And he has a very powerful blowtorch. And he's up there at that triangle trying to heat this block of steel. Next slide, please. Thank you. But he can only reach so far down the organization. And I think in our experience, when things don't go right, it is primarily because of a lack of understanding or a lack of communication that provides that consistency of message across all levels of the organization. So to be really impactful, the next layer of the organization also needs to be engaged. Next slide, Mike. They need to have their own little blowtorch to drive that consistency of message down in the organization. And then one more time, please. Thank you. Only after multiple levels of the organization fully understand the direction, fully understand what needs to be done to get there, fully understand the specifics of what needs to be done to get there, does the organization operate in a consistent manner to get to the true north. And when we look at it, many things matter. Consistency of message matters. And the message has to be delivered multiple times, because the first time the message is sent, it's usually garbled in translation. And not only do we have to answer the why question, which is primarily the most important question, why are we doing this? But what needs to be done? How will it be done? Who will do this implementation work? That becomes important. And again, the ability to manage this over a period of time. It depends on each individual organization on how long this transformational activity takes. And one has to recognize that there is no hard and fast rule on how long it takes. The primary function of leadership in this policy deployment journey really is about coaching. And it's really about encouraging the organization to do things differently. And the way we do that really is through the last part, which is the leader standard work, and Mike touched on that. And we use leader standard work to redefine roles and responsibilities, and that is where the change process comes in, because managers and supervisors and even directors and vice presidents are really there because they did the things that they were supposed to do well. And any change in policy now requires them to readjust and do things differently, and that requires a significant amount of work to drive that change management process, right? So what they did as supervisors made them managers, and what they did as managers made them directors. And that is why our leader standard work not only focuses on the specifics of the day-to-day activities, but primarily focuses on how managers can coach their supervisors in adopting, understanding, and embracing the new way of doing things. And that, I think, is the hardest part of the leader standard work that we encounter when we try to deliver this methodology to get people to embrace the new way, is because they have to give up what they are most familiar with. And so policy deployment, therefore, then becomes more about coaching and supporting the organizational leaders as they make their leap from what was comfortable in the past to essentially what is the uncertainty of the future. How do we deploy policy deployment? I'm going to show you a few slides now that kind of talk about some elements that we have found are important. Go ahead, next slide, Mike. Okay, so many of you probably have what are called obeyer rooms or mission control rooms or some other terms thereof, which are really designed around getting senior leadership engaged in this change process. But I think I would ask the question, what value do these mission control rooms provide? And in order for the mission control rooms to provide that value, they have to be designed a certain way. So for example, here is one mission control room. Clearly, a lot of informational charts on the wall, right? Perhaps most of them are valuable and of benefit. But there is also this large table, and there's lots of chairs around it, right? So this is something that we used to refer to in past life and past clients as what we called it the PMO office, the program management office, right? And we have to be careful that mission control rooms that are driving policy deployment do not convert into PMO offices where the senior leadership sits on that table and teams come in one at a time, make a presentation with the PowerPoint deck using a standard format, of course, and then they either critiqued or commended for their performance, or, in worst cases, told what they need to do next. So, the purpose of the mission control room cannot be a governance architecture. It has to be a process where there is true benefit to be had, both from an organizational standpoint as well as from the team standpoint. So our mission control rooms exist as stand-up meetings where there is a two-way communication. It is not a presentation. It is about what needs to be done by the teams and what needs to be done by the senior leadership as well, to look at the data, to understand what is driving that data, to understand what the gaps are and what the hurdles are. And there needs to be a way of measuring effectiveness. It cannot be a presentation. It has to be a discussion. Okay, so in our experience, mission control rooms are very valuable when they are designed and implemented for a specific purpose in mind, and that purpose has to be front and center. Next slide, Mike. Okay, so oftentimes in a tool-focused engagement, consultants or even lean leaders talk about the what that needs to be done, not the why. And I'll give you an example. 5S is a very popular activity, as many of you are probably aware of. And oftentimes you get asked the question, what is 5S? Are you implementing 5S? And I would say to the audience that, I have never used the term 5S because it really isn't 5S. It's not an activity. It really is 5 S's, which are implemented in sequence, right? So the concern arises when we implement the 5 S's, and unless we explain to our people what the sort process is and how the sort process leads into the other 4 processes, they start believing the 5 S's to be a process of housekeeping. So a small example on getting people to understand the broader picture on why we do the 5 S's. It is not about sweeping the floor, and it's not about straightening, and it's not about sorting, and it's not about any of those one things, but it works holistically. And the way we do that is we really follow a learn, do, learn approach, which is we introduce the tools, we coach people and hold their hands in actually implementing the tools. We follow up with the next layer. They go implement the layer, and that process continues. And this is where it becomes important. Unless they can see the necklace as a result of the beads that they are moving, they will not be engaged. Or they may be doing the things that you ask them to do, but they will never understand why they're doing it. And we spend a great amount of time explaining why things are being done, not necessarily what needs to be done. And it takes a while. It takes a while. In our experience, sometimes it could take as much as 2 to 3 months before people can transition from the what of doing things to the broader understanding of why things are being done. Next slide, Mike. Okay, this is another key challenge: dashboards and visual management. Dashboards exist to inform. That is the purpose of the dashboards, right? And I think oftentimes people talk about dashboards in terms of that is the primary element of implementing improvement. They're not. And you've probably seen dashboards in many places. I have seen them in stairwell landings. I've seen them in main hallways. Their basic purpose is to inform an external audience, not necessarily the internal owners of those processes. And that's the fundamental difference between dashboards and visual management. Oftentimes, when you look at dashboards in hallways or stairwells or other places like that, or lunchrooms, the charts on those are usually very nicely done computer-generated charts. Oftentimes, they are sometimes months, if not years old, because they are remnants of some prior initiative which was deemed successful, right? So that's what happens. We call something successful and we end it. And then these are remnants that are left behind. So why is visual management different? Next slide, please. Thank you. So the purpose of visual management systems is not just to inform, but it really is to improve, right? So among the many things in a visual management system are not just the daily and weekly KPI performance indicators and today's issues and plans, but really a mechanism to improve the current performance. And that is driven by whatever methodology is used. It really doesn't matter, but active improvement projects, and you can use A3 or some other formats like that. But in addition to the performance measures and today's issues and the active improvement projects, there is also a place in there to recognize the improvement projects that were successfully completed. And we'll talk more about the A3s in the next slide, but it's important to recognize the improvement projects that were completed to ensure that people understand that there is progress being made. Lastly, there should be a place for opportunities that are identified but are not active currently, and we'll talk about that as well in the next slide. On the visual management systems, one of the questions that is asked often is, why do they have to be manually entered or manually drawn by the frontline or the supervisor or whoever owns that process? Why can't it be computer generated? And you know, I've always been a proponent of the hand-drawn charts because they drive engagement, they drive ownership, they drive understanding, and all of the reasons why it made sense to do them by hand. Lately, I think we are beginning to have a change of heart on this process, primarily because information systems are becoming so good that you could potentially replace at least a portion of the visual management system with the computer screen that is really pulling data off a real-time database somewhere and presenting it as a chart, right? So when we really sit back and we get questioned a lot, why am I spending time going to the website, the same website that has the charts, copying the data on a piece of paper, bringing it to the visual management system, and drawing it by hand? Would it not be much better if we just showed the screen? So I think the jury's still out on that, whether it really drives engagement or not, but it certainly goes back towards, are there ways to reduce the 8 ways? So this would be clearly over-processing if we could achieve the same result by just having a display screen. So something that we're still mulling over. Not sure there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but would love to get your input into that. Okay, next slide, Mike. Okay, so we were going to talk about A3s. And A3s is a generic term for what I would call a structured problem-solving process, right? And the key message here is it really is not important how many A3s are active. It only matters how many A3s have been successfully closed and completed and closed. Oftentimes there is this attitude that you need to have multiple A3s open. I would say, on the other hand, you need to have very few A3s open. The idea being the number of A3s open should be directly proportional to the resource availability and the competency of those resources, right? They have to be completed, and they have to be completed in time bound. So one of our strategies when we talk about A3s and problem solving is to ensure that any given group, any given owner of a visual management board does not have more than 3 A3s currently being implemented. And that number could be 2, could be 4, depending on how big that group is, but really less than a handful. And we do emphasize that the A3s need to have a completion date that is between 4 and 6 weeks out. So there is no A3 that we recommend that stretches beyond 6 weeks. That is done primarily to ensure the attention of the team to work on these implementation plans that are coming out of the A3. So clearly, 6 week allowed time to implement and complete the A3s, and defines really the scope of the A3, right? So we break them down into smaller chunks. Oftentimes, if you have a really good Hoshin plan, the A3s that you have to implement towards that Hoshin plan should be immune from the monthly performance, in this case, a negative monthly performance, right? Which means that oftentimes what happens is when we have the monthly reviews, in certain companies, what happens is the senior leadership team looks at the performance or lack of performance and asks, what are you doing about it? And the poor team who's presenting essentially comes up with 3 new A3s that they're going to work on, right? Well, they already had 5 that they were working on that is nowhere close to completion. Now they're going to work on 3 more. Totally unnecessary. And if well designed, a Hoshin plan should really be immune from the changes in the monthly performance. If they stick to their plan, if it was a good plan, if they were good supporting A3s, then really the monthly performance number should be ignored at least over a period of 2, if not 3 months. Then you can look and say whether the Hoshin plan was right. And the last thing about A3 is that they have to be appropriately scoped. We talked about the 4 to 6 week period. So we very strongly emphasize that the scope of an A3 can only be scoped downwards, not upwards. And that is important for the organization. It's important for the project team that is working the A3. And in reality, it's really more important for gaining that change in performance, because only closed and completed A3s matter. There's a box on the bottom that says, how do you boil the ocean? And really you do it by 1 cup at a time, right? So that is the whole idea, is you have multiple small A3s implemented in 6 weeks that are actually more impactful than 1 large A3 spread out over many months. Next slide, Mike, please. Okay, so this is the daily huddle. I am sure you have that in your organizations as well. Absolutely a very good way to do this. And this picture kind of does justice to it in many ways, right? So you have a board, looks like it's hand-drawn. You have a team standing around the board. Looks like everybody, perhaps except 2, are actually focused on the board or the speaker, right? So a fairly effective meeting. I just happened to notice the difference in attire, right? We have a guy wearing a suit, talking to a group of looks like people who own the process, so there's some question about that. Perhaps a consultant. But the point is that a daily huddle by itself is not necessarily sufficient to drive transformational change, because a daily huddle by design focuses on the now, focuses on the today, and perhaps the tomorrow, and in some cases this week. It doesn't focus on the future. So there has to be a concurrent process that not only looks at the now, but really looks forward to 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year, etc. And that takes me to my next slide, which brings us out, right? So as most of you know, and the numbers could be a little bit different in your experience, but about 90% of lean deployments fail, right? But they don't fail because, why do they fail, right? And I think the question is, if in spite of 90% of lean deployments failing, lean is still very popular, and more companies are starting their lean journeys now than stopping it. So what is it that is about the lean process that 90% of them essentially end up disappointing the organization? And we find that if the lean process or the lean journey is primarily focused on the tactical, if it is primarily focused on cost or quality or delivery-based improvement programs, the shelf life of those kind of initiatives is roughly 2 to 3 years, after which they fall victim to cost-cutting themselves, right? Senior leaders declare mission accomplished, we know what we're doing, and we can do it by ourselves now, right? So that's what happens. A pure transactional, a tactical lean approach usually has a 3-year lifespan. So I put a Wall Street Journal article at the bottom of that page. This is about 2004, 2003, in that neighborhood, when Toyota was going through a lot of quality issues. And one of the things that was noted in this Wall Street Journal article was the reason why Toyota was having issues was because of a lack of production gurus. In this case, they were referring to them as senseis, right? So they had narrowed down the analysis of Toyota, came back and said, the reason why we're having so many issues is because we really do not have these experienced senseis to help us manage through this transition and improve our processes. And this is Toyota, who's been doing it for 40 years, 50 years, more than that. So it's important. The role of a lean leader must be transformational, because that is what lean excellence is, or operational excellence is, or business excellence is. And in order for the lean leader to be transformational, they cannot just be lean experts. They really have to be business experts in that industry. And they really have to provide thought leadership at the C-level. Because without that, it's a pure transactional process that senior leaders will believe they have mission accomplished in 3 years. That's what happens. At the same time, lean leaders have to have the ability to work across all levels. Thought leadership at the C-level and coaching at all levels. They have to bring that whole organization along. I'll show you that on the next slide. So Mike, please, next slide. This is the Olympic gold medal winners in high jump, okay? And it goes from 1900s to the 1980s. What do you see here, right? In the early part of the 20th century, the primary approach was the scissors jump, right? And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 data points with a trend line on it, right? If you were operating in that time period, your objective would be to improve on the prior score using the same methodology, right? That I would call the Kaizen approach, right? Continuous improvement. But then what happened? In the 1920s, there was a disruption. The process of the method of high jumping changed from a scissors type jump to a Western roll. Significant discontinuity. How do you handle that with continuous improvement? You can't. You have to have that transformational approach, understanding what may happen. And that needs to be part of your lean approach as well. And then, the Western role then migrated to a straddle, again, a significant discontinuity. And finally, in the 80s, another discontinuity called the Fosbury flop. And you can see that these lines will never intersect if he was primarily doing Kaizen type incremental improvement. Okay, so go to the next slide, Mike. So when we think of our operational excellence or business excellence programs, we consider them to be a function of three fundamental blocks. They have to focus on all three of these blocks. The first one is managing the present, which includes the performance improvement of the todays and the tomorrows, either in cost, quality, delivery, safety, etc. But concurrently helping the organization create the future. Concurrently helping the organization create the future. Because as I showed you earlier, when that disruption happens, not only do lean leaders working with the C-level executives need to identify or understand the future, but also need to come up with a roadmap on how that organization is going to get there. Because without it, we have lots of examples of companies who manage the present very, very well, who are no longer around, right? Because they could not either understand the future or create the future and know how to get there. Here's the next slide, which explains this a little better. Mike, thank you. So the role of a right lean leader is what? In addition to doing the continuous improvement activities, they really have to challenge the status quo. Here is an example of what could potentially be a transformational opportunity for healthcare. It's an article in the New York Times from 2014. It talks about the average wait time in days to see a provider. 72 days to see a dermatologist in Boston. 56 days in Minneapolis, 49 in Philadelphia. Is there opportunity there for improvement? Of course there is, but it isn't an easy one to solve, right? But it really is an important one to consider as part of the transformational opportunity facing healthcare. The unfortunate aspect of this status quo with this long delay times is practitioners themselves go towards the secondary markets when their child needs to get a tetanus shot or a physical for a sport activity or some other thing that they know their current organization cannot deliver in the time frames that is required. It's clearly a big opportunity, and clearly is a complicated opportunity to address, but something that ought to be thought through. Mike, is that you? Better. Thank you. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. Thanks, Mike. Okay. Here's another slide that talks about what could be some of the transformational opportunities in healthcare, right? This is the view of the healthcare system across the world in key countries in 2013, which is about 3 years after the ACA was passed. If you look down at the very bottom, United States, 25%, only 25% of the surveyed participants thought the healthcare system in the U.S. was working well and only needed minor changes. The majority said either it needed to be completely rebuilt or needed fundamental changes. So clearly, that is what your customer expectation of the healthcare industry is. Lead leaders in the healthcare industry need to look at that and say, what can I help to improve that? Yeah. Next slide, Mike. Okay. So good transformation is hard, but good transformation is also necessary. This particular article is from 2014, but it is talking about Toyota in the middle of the 2008 depression, okay, when they had a significant chunk of volume reduction. They're talking about the Toyota truck plant, the Tundra plant. They could have continued with the Kaizen activities, which they are known for, but they chose to set a rather aggressive challenge. They chose to reduce their fixed costs. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the automotive industry, that's a fairly significant challenge to post. Reducing fixed costs is not an easy thing. So on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, if you look at those two lines, the green line is the revenue line, which in most cases cannot move. And the red line is the cost line. So if you think of continuous improvement or Kaizen type events, change the slope of that line, right? What Toyota was asking its lean leaders to do was to move the intercept of that line down. And that process, truly transformational, required them to make fundamental changes, not just in manufacturing, but all the way upstream and downstream as well. They had to change product development. They had to look at their supply base. They had to look at how they design their facilities. It was significant change, significant transformational change, and it was part of the mandate of that lean group working in Toyota. So it is not unreasonable to expect the lean organization to not just deliver improvements of today, but also position the organization for success tomorrow. All right? And next slide, Mike, and this is my last slide. So in summary, our client experience teaches us that if we need to have an organization dedicated to delivering on the long-term plan, then we need to have C-level leaders engaged in thinking about the transformation activities, but we also need the lean leaders to keep those C-level leaders engaged in transformational thinking and actually to help them figure out a roadmap to get to that new tomorrow. Pure transactional lean initiatives, roughly 2 to 4 year shelf life, then the organization essentially says mission accomplished and moves on to the next big thing. It's rather easy to develop a Hoshin plan. There's a lot of companies know how to create those plans. A lot of consultants help companies create those plans, but executing the plan is extremely challenging. And that is where the money is. So that is where we really need those lean leaders to drive that plan and deliver on that plan across that entire organization. The right measures. The organization needs to have the right measures in place to measure whether they are progressing down that roadmap. As an example, oftentimes we have how many associates are trained in lean, right? Do we have certification programs? Do we have different levels of certifications? Now that is an important metric. We need to know how well we are building the capability of that organization, but it's a metric. It's not a KPI. The KPI is what are those associates delivering in terms of improvements. Staying the course. If you have the right plan, if you have the right execution strategy, if you're working on the right things, then do not get distracted by a month or a quarter of unfavorable performance results. Clearly, do not go add to your existing workload and create more A3s or more problem-solving activities. You'll never complete them. And unfortunately, that is what happens. We have limited resources, the same capacity, yet we increase the number of problem-solving activities that we want people to perform. And that usually doesn't work. Preventing mission accomplished syndrome. You know, what is mission accomplished? I think if we are transformational, we clearly know we are not there yet. And making sure the organization understands what mission accomplished means. And lastly, to be in the good graces of the senior leadership, deliver bite-sized improvements. Transformation is a long journey, and it's important to have those intermediate results, well-defined, well-designed, bite-sized improvements to ensure that the leadership maintains their engagement. So that's what we have learned, and I'm sure you have similar or dissimilar learnings. I'd love to hear about them. Mike, that really was my last slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ajay. I've unmuted the lines if anyone has any questions or comments, perspectives similar to this. I'm looking at the chat function. I've got Dirk asking, when you talked about limiting reaction to monthly performance, does this refer to the general business performance or the performance of the topic the A3 is on or the A3 itself?
That's a good question. It's actually both. So if you think of the metrics in terms of Six Sigma and normal variation, and then just because you did not meet whatever the specific metric was, target for the month, does not necessarily mean that you should stop doing what you're doing and do something else. What I meant to say was, if you have a well thought through approach, if you have a well thought through action plan, and you're working that action plan well, sometimes monthly results do not reflect the amount of effort put on that action plan. There could be other factors affecting that metric, and that you should not create more work just because you missed a month. That was my point.
Okay. Mike has a question here. One of the challenges in healthcare is frequent churn in the C-suite, yet the C-suite has to own strategy deployment. Any thoughts on how to mitigate this?
Could you repeat that question one more time?
So one of the challenges in healthcare is frequent churn or turnover in the C-suite, yet the C-suite has to own the strategy deployment process. Any thoughts on how to mitigate this?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that process. Yes, it is very hard. And I think the way we have addressed it in two specific situations was, yes, unfortunately, that level, there's a lot of change happening too frequently. We have worked with the next level down, because the next level down and the levels down below it tend to be fairly stable, even in healthcare. The changes happen at the very top, sometimes more frequently in other places. But we do work with the lower levels, so they can be our sponsors when that C-level change happens. But yes, it's incredibly hard when you have those changes at the top, because the new leader has to come in and own the process, and it has to be their process, and they may have different thoughts on how to get there. Absolutely, it's a tough one. Mm-hmm. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
This is Mike Spencer. Can I just add a comment?
Sure, of course.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Ajay. I'm the one who submitted the question about the C-suite. I guess the other thing I would add to your answer would be, from our experience at Stanford Children's, would be one, advising people to seriously consider implementing the new strategy deployment very early on in their lean transformation. And two, to see if there's a way that you can have the cycle of it be more frequently than annual. That way, if you do it early and you do it more frequently, you stand more of a chance of running multiple PDCA cycles to make the deployment process itself a little bit more robust, so that when the C-suite does turn over, because it's more of a when than an if, then there's more of a chance that the process has grown some roots.
That's a very good point. Absolutely. Having more frequent cycles clearly gives a new leader a chance to engage in the process and not feel like he has to come up with something new as well. Perfect. Thank you, Mike.
I'll pause to see if there's any other questions. Okay. Well, Ajay agreed that he was going to make a PDF copy available, which will get processed, and I'll put that out to everyone that participated as well as everyone on our distribution list. So the recording from today's session, if you go to our website, it's going to be moved over from upcoming webinars over to the webinar recording. You'll get a copy of that. Coming up in March, on Friday the 10th, our friends from Winneshiek Medical Center in Decorah, Iowa are going to present. They made a presentation recently at a rural hospital conference in Phoenix, and they also presented with the Critical Access Hospital Conference. And so they've got some good information to share about their current journey. And then later in March, my friend Debbie McAllister is going to talk about coaching, power of vulnerability in coaching. Just some notes here. If you go to our publications page on our website, our latest white paper, True North, is something you may want to take a look at it. And also conversations and learnings from this webinar and other webinars related to strategy deployment are going to be compiled into a future white paper called Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. And so I'll be reaching out to friends and colleagues such as Ajay and others that are on this distribution that perhaps would like to share their thoughts on what are some of the latest thinking as far as what they've seen work and doesn't related to strategy deployment. It's something that a lot of people are trying to better understand. And also, if you or anyone that you know of has a story or some lessons learned they'd like to share, please let me know. We'll have it featured in one of our future webinars. And also, if you want to join our learning and sharing exchange, it's on LinkedIn. You can do so by connecting with me, and I'll see that you're invited there. So I want to thank Ajay for taking the time to put this together. I want to thank everyone for taking some time on a Monday to listen to it. And I hope everyone has a good day. And if you're traveling, travel safe. Thanks again, Ajay.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.